So we have a rapidly changing, increasingly complex world. You're familiar with this term, I'm sure, VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. It's a term used originally by the American Army, the US Army during the first Iraq War. But it's very appropriate for today's world. The second word I'd use is permacrisis, about where we are today. This was voted the 2022 word of the year by Collins Dictionary. And the third phrase is permanent instability. This is a phrase that is very commonly used by the bureaucrats, or the technocrats, I should say, in Brussels. So that sort of just, shows where we are in this world today, with lots of unfortunate things happening, many of them due to climate change. So let's look at what are the main disruptors in the 21st century. These will be all familiar to you. I won't go through them in detail. But I think that a real question here is, which do you feel will present the biggest leadership challenges in your working lifetime? And I guess the younger you are, the more complicated that answer is going to be. In fact, it's not only a complicated answer, it's a complex answer, because there's no way that we can know which of those are going to be the most important. We can predict, we can have our opinions, but we won't know until we look back in history which of these disruptors were the ones that were really important. Stephen Hawking has said that, I think the 21st century will be the century of complexity. There is no limit to the complexity that we can build using simple, basic laws. And addressing complexity requires systems thinking. So instead of thinking about machines, we have to think about organisms. If you think of the internal combustion engine, it's a very complicated piece of engineering, but it's very predictable. You know what outcome you need, and you design it to get that outcome. In an organism, it's very different. If we look, we've got to realize that we're moving from a Newtonian to a quantum physics type of world, where Newtonian physics is based on precise mathematical formulas and cause and effect, and it's rational. Whereas quantum physics is the study of matter and energy at the most fundamental level. Randomness is built into the system. Observations change its state, and it's about probabilities rather than known outcomes. It's a totally different picture. We can see how complexity has a totally different impact, and how when we design, if we look at this fractal diagram, for example, that is beyond complicated. It's complex. It's the laws of nature, which also means that we need to move from deterministic leadership to non-deterministic leadership, which means that we don't know what the results are going to be, and are more likely to be without common sense and beyond rational thinking. However, it's not about one or the other. We've got to think in terms of both. We will still need the Newtonian thinking, but on top of that, we need to think in quantum terms. So it's thinking more like a gardener than a watchmaker. So what are the rules of complexity? Well, complex adaptive systems is a theory that was first developed in about 1980 and has since developed quite a lot into very sophisticated, I wouldn't say necessarily totally proven, but it fits in very well with the laws of nature, which is where we really need to go to be able to understand and react to a complex adaptive system. And the simple rules are, apart from it, the need for there to be a clear purpose, is that in a complex adaptive system, there are many individual parts or agents. Importantly, it provides no leader to coordinate action of others. Really important. It generates emergent patterns through the interaction of these agents or different parts. And it reacts and adapts if the elements of the system change. So we have a non-linear relationship between input and output. Typical organization chart, if we're talking about organizations and leadership, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. But actually, in the real world, it doesn't work like that. It works more like this. And this is what we've got to be thinking about. We've got to change our mindset. We've got to change our mental model if we're going to be able to lead successfully in the future. A murmuration of starlings is a very good example of a complex system where there is no individual leader as such. And compare that to the matriarchal organization of elephants, where they tread the same path year after year. And when there is a drought, they know where to find water based on history. Again, it's not one or the other, it's both. We need both. But at the moment, our mindset tends to be on the linear, the Newtonian, the historical. So what are the transpersonal practices of CAS? In other words, what are the things that we need to have in the organization, in our thinking, in order to be able to lead effectively in the future? The first one is everyone's a leader. Everybody needs to be a leader. They need to think of themselves as a leader. Whenever you're making a decision, take an action. You are a leader, and that action or decision making is affecting somebody else. We need value-led sustainability. In other words, we need to think about sustainability and regeneration in a way that is for the greater good, not for our own interest. We need to be able to think emergently, holistically. We need to become more self-aware and better at managing ourselves. We need to balance feedback versus independence. We need to be adaptive, manage chaos and random probability. When diversity is the norm, we need to have some sense of vocation in what we do as leaders. And finally, a very human thing, we need enjoyment. So the right future requires leadership that is more decentralized and distributed, more inclusive yet emergent, more values-based, and more caring. Everyone's a leader. So in providing a strong sense of relevant purpose, we need to decentralize decision-making, but centralizing collaboration, coordination, and communication. We've got to think about from the few to the many. Traditionally, we just have a few leaders. In the future, we will need to have many leaders. When times are complex and decision stakes are high, a wider dialogue with key stakeholders is critical. Leaving decisions to a powerful few, even if talented, is dangerous. And the more power you give to a single individual in the face of complexity and uncertainty, the more likely a bad decision will be made. And it's worth pointing out that the UK, according to the OECD, is the most centralized rich nation in the world. And I'm sure you can think of the many policies and procedures and that we've gone through over the last months and years will demonstrate that. We need to move in how we set strategy. Typically, if you look at the top line there, we have a functional organization where the method of formulation is top down and the outcome is clear, fixed, but not fully owned. It's only owned by the people who set it. We've got to move down that chart. I won't go through the whole thing through matrices and so on and so forth, but at the bottom, we have a complex adaptive system, which is both bottom up and top down dynamic with a clear fluid owned. In research that's been done recently, in major decisions, successful decisions, 68% of that decision making has come from the bottom up rather than the top down. The result of that is that we can get autonomy, we can be engaged, empowered, trusting, non-hierarchical, emergent, self-organizing, evolving from the bottom up, continual feedback. Excuse me. Who wouldn't like that? Who wouldn't like to be in an organization like that? It's often idealized as a learning organization, but what kind of culture would this experience deliver? And what kind of leadership would this experience require? That's what we'll move into. So we call it transpersonal leadership. And a transpersonal leader, they operate beyond their ego, realizing personal development and learning is lifelong. They're radical, ethical, authentic, while emotionally intelligent and caring. And they create performance-enhancing, values-based and sustainable cultures. And it's just worth having a quick look at this diagram here, where we're talking about three types of intelligence. Rational intelligence, which is where the predominance of our education is at the moment. Everything's about, it has to be analytical, has to be cause and effect, etc., etc. However, if you need to combine it with emotional intelligence in order to get that performance enhancement. Emotional intelligence is about behaviors. It's about relationships. And then spiritual intelligence, which has, by the way, nothing to do with religion in this context, is about values and ethics. If you combine the spiritual and the emotional, that's where you get the caring and sustainability. And it's when you combine the rational and the spiritual that you get ethics. It's important that we have all three. And it's that sweet spot in the middle that is where leaders need to be to become and be transpersonal leaders.